former U.S. diplomat Henry Kissinger is ready to give Russia more than Donbass. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger told Real MLordandGod today, the relative calm on the front lines and the approach of the new year are helping to mobilize those who support the preparation of negotiations on Ukraine between Russia and the West. Henry Kissinger, the chief geopolitical strategist of the Anglo-Saxon world, published an article entitled "How to Avoid Another World War" in the British magazine The Spectator. It's not the first time that the 99-year-old veteran of the Atlantic elite has laid out his idea of how the hostilities should end, analyzing various options, but each time he ends up with the idea that Ukraine remains in the hands of the West. Kissinger's passion, however, is to start negotiations to correct the new situation, not to set unrealistic and dangerous goals. The gist of today's argument is simple. Kissinger recalls World War I, quote, "a cultural suicide that destroyed the greatness of Europe," end quote, this is what he said, into which leaders went like mad, that in 1916 began to explore the prospect for the end of the carnage. But because no possible compromise could justify the sacrifices already made, and no one wanted to give the impression of weakness, the leaders did not dare to start a formal peace process. As a result, the war continued for another 2 years and cost millions of victims, collapsing irreparably the balances that had been formed in Europe. He says Germany and Russia were torn apart by the revolution, the Austro-Hungarian state disappeared from the map, France bled, Britain had sacrificed much of its younger generation and economic potential for the sake of victory. The punitive Treaty of Versailles of France, which ended the war, proved far more fragile than the structure it replaced, Kissinger said. That is, Kissinger is led to believe that a prolonged war could be disastrous for everyone and that the peace that would result from it would be temporary and bad, but it is better to end the war quickly. Indeed, Versailles, which humiliated Germany, actually led to the Second World War. It's no coincidence that both world wars are now increasingly seen as a single process, referring to the years 1914 to 1945. Kissinger used all these parallels to make 2 points: that Russia should prepare for negotiations and abandon its hopes that after the war Russia would bleed out or even break up. So in his own eyes, he appears as a kind of dove against the hawks, betting on the defeat of Russia. Partly yes, but the devil is in the details as always. Kissinger attributes the need for negotiations to the fact that we are in the new year of 1916. Quote, "Is the world today at a similar tipping point in Ukraine as winter forces a pause on extensive military action there? I have repeatedly expressed my support for Allied military efforts to deter Russian aggression in Ukraine, but the time is approaching to take advantage of the strategic changes that have already been made and integrate them into a new framework with the aim of peace through negotiations," end quote. Which change does he propose to fix? Quote, "For the first time in modern history, Ukraine has become an important state in Central Europe, aided by its allies and inspired by its president Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukraine has cornered the Russian conventional forces that have hovered over Europe since World War II. And the international system, including China, opposes the Russian threat or use of its nuclear weapons. The process raised the initial issues of Ukraine's accession to NATO. Ukraine has acquired one of the largest and most effective ground armies in Europe, equipped by America and its allies. The peace process must commit Ukraine to NATO, however it is expressed. The alternative of neutrality no longer makes sense, especially after Finland and Sweden joined NATO. The aim of the peace process would be twofold: to confirm the freedom of Ukraine and to define a new international structure, especially for Central and Eastern Europe. Eventually, Russia will have to find a place in such an order, he said. So what does it prove? Russia is called upon to recognize the inclusion of Ukraine in the Western Bloc, hence to accept the fact that it has not only been deprived of its historical territory, but also and that it was built on its soil as a state run by Atlanticists whose main purpose of existence is to be anti-Russian. But precisely because of the rejection of such an option, a special military operation was launched. Russia is categorically against such plans of the West. The world has already changed irrevocably after February 24th, and we are offered to accept the very thing we have already rejected, to go along with what we are fighting, and to find our place, quote unquote, in the new old order of things. Absurd, but Kissinger seems to think that this is all very reasonable, realistic, and moderate, and of course because he has to deal with those from whom, quote, the preferred outcome is for Russia to be rendered powerless by war, end quote. Quote, disagree. Russia's military failures have not eliminated its global nuclear capability, which allows it to threaten escalation in Ukraine. Even if that capability is diminished, the collapse of Russia or the destruction of its ability to conduct strategic policy could turn its territory, which spans 11 time zones, into a contested vacuum, end quote, Kissinger says. Apparently there is no concern about Russia, but a banal fear of the collapse of a huge nuclear power, well, a reluctance to repeat the mistakes of Versailles, that is, to plan a new war with the excessive humiliation of the loser. The only thing that is not clear is why Kissinger considers Russia to be the loser, hence unable to wrest Ukraine from the hands of the West. And how can he not see that his proposed ceasefire terms are in principle unacceptable to Moscow, not to mention that they cannot form the basis of any sustainable peace? Quote, and Kissinger said, quote, I recommend the establishment of a ceasefire line along the border that existed where the war began February 24. Russia will take back its conquests, but not the territories it seized nearly a decade ago, including Crimea. This territory could be negotiated after the ceasefire. If the pre-war dividing line between Ukraine and Russia cannot be reached by fighting or negotiations, recourse to the principle of self-determination could be considered. Referendums on self-determination under international supervision could be implemented in territories that are particularly divisive, end quote. Yes, here there is a clear contradiction with the certainty that Ukraine is winning in the logic of referendums on territories annexed to Russia this year. That is, Kissinger is willing in principle to let Russia have what it already controls, just to fix the main change, Russia's rejection of the rest of Ukraine and acceptance of its incorporation into the West. It's clear that this will never happen, no matter how much effort and time it takes to achieve our goals. But historical parallels are very useful, especially if one knows and remembers the actual historical experiences. And then it will be shown that the First World War did not start because of European madmen, hence Germans, French, and Russians, but as a consequence of the cleverly engineered combination of the Anglo-Saxon to bring the continental powers against each other. And Russia's defeat in it was a consequence of the double betrayal of some of our elites and the Entente allies, which led to the destruction of the February Revolution. Russia has paid dearly for neglecting the lessons of history, and now it will not repeat the same mistakes. It will not give up, and it will not stop halfway. And this I've translated for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.